Why did sex divide American Christians? Why did that happen? Well, Dr. Armory Griffith, you are a scholar of religion and politics. You are a professor at one of America's finest universities, Washington University. You're a PhD from Harvard. You're a UVA undergrad. You're a historian, a researcher, an author of a book that I loved, Moral Combat. Welcome to the Iconoclast podcast.
Oh, thank you so much, David, for having me. I'm really honored and excited to be here and talk to you.
Yeah. Well, the book came out before COVID, and I found it around then. But what I did want to ask you is, why did sex divide American Christians? Why did that happen?
Well, yes, that is a huge question. And that's really the question I was asking when I went out to write the book. And maybe a little personal background is helpful about this. I grew up evangelical. And I just remember that the kind of sexual rules were so important. I mean, something that seemed to be talked about as much or more than anything else, and in ways that were always puzzling to me. And as an adult, as you say, I went and got my PhD and got interested in gender and religion, but it always just seemed to me that evangelicalism in particular, but also Catholicism and also some branches of liberal Protestantism, just couldn't stop talking about sex and sexuality. And those issues just didn't seem to me to be core doctrinal issues. I didn't see them a lot in the Bible, which I read a lot as a child. So I think this question has been living inside of me for much of my life. And finally, it sort of surfaced that I'd never really answered that question. So I dug deep to write that. And I think there are complicated answers to that. There's a politics to it. There are genuine fears, I think, that drive people's anxieties and angst about their own sexuality and the sexual behaviors of other people. So it's really complicated, but it obviously touches something very, very deep in people. And we just keep sort of arguing over these issues religiously and politically over and over again.
And why Christians? I mean, you're a religious scholar as well. So is it because Christianity has dominated the West, whether it was arriving on the Mayflower with American Puritans, and then I think the Catholics arrived in Baltimore, I think at some point. And is it because America's leanings? Do other religions, have Mormons dealt with this? We have a lot of Muslim immigration now. Why sex and Christians?
Yeah, well, everything you've said is true about the U.S. focus and Puritans and all of that, but I think it goes back a lot further than that, to Paul, frankly. I mean, I think we can go back to, and maybe beyond that, we can see sexual worries in the Hebrew Bible too, but I would say the clearest answer would be to go back to Paul and some of the early church fathers and the fear of the body overtaking the soul in some way and the need to be pure and the sort of rise of this notion of celibacy as being the purest way that one can live in the world. I really do think we can trace an awful lot back to that. And in college, I actually studied medieval Christianity quite a bit. And, there are certainly sexual obsessions, not only in the early church, but throughout the medieval era, well into the modern era. So I think it goes much deeper than something specifically American. But having said that, there is something specifically American, it seems to me, because Christian Europe, there's I don't see the same obsession with sex in European countries, and haven't seen that for a very, very long time. So I do think there has been something, I don't want to say unique, but something distinctive in the U.S. that probably stems from our Puritan heritage and some of the specific Christian influences that shaped this country in its early years.
Was it? I mean, certainly that's curious to me. Because obviously Calvinism, which I think the Puritans, were mostly Calvinists, and yet Calvinism is European. So, was it something specifically about the Massachusetts Puritans that I remember taking a class on specifically American colonial religion in grad school myself, and I thought, wow, some of the issues we're seeing at the end of the 20th century and 21st century are uniquely tethered all the way back to the Puritans of Massachusetts.
Oh, yes.
No?
Oh,
So why
absolutely.
not Europe? Did Europe ever see it? Do you have a thesis, an argument as to why it's uniquely American?
Well, and I shouldn't say it's uniquely American. I think Europe at the time of, the Reformation, the Counter-Reformation, certainly medieval Europe before that, you did have an obsession with sex. What I'm really meaning is that I think today we don't see it in the same way.
Yeah.
It has something to do with the history of church-state separation in the United States, the disestablishment of religion early on that meant that, religion just flourished in a different way apart from the government in the United States. And in Europe, where, there still exist state churches, there was a lot of rebellion against that and a lot of indifference to that. And, I think it's just we've been shaped differently in the U.S. and
Sure.
that's made a big difference in how we think about sex and sexuality.
Sure, sure. The do you think anything with the frontier aspect of America, which Europe, certainly by the time the Calvinists had arrived, Europe as a frontier was certainly not the case. I think mostly a city state, maybe. But yeah, was it just the New World? It just came with a new. Is that
Yeah. I
thoughts
mean,
on it?
well, sure. I think the frontier environment of the U.S. and the constant move west certainly shaped the fervency of evangelicalism, and there's a whole history in the U.S. of these circuit riding preachers who would travel around to church and revivals and all of that. I certainly think that has deeply shaped not only the evangelical tradition in the U.S., but just the larger Christianity that we see for sure. And of course, that's interesting that you bring that up because revivals were also places where there was a lot of anxiety about ecstatic experience and what that might lead to. And, we have to rein the youth in, or they're going off and, the fear was they would go off and have sex, which some certainly did. So, the religion and sex sort of relationship is very deep and very old. It's changed over time in the U.S., but it has certainly been part of our history, I think, all along the way.
Yeah. And I'm going to guess you and I are pretty close to the same age. I might be a little older than you. And you talked a little bit about I think I heard somewhere, you were raised Southern Baptist?
Yes, that's right. Yes.
So were you the Southern Baptist kid in the youth group, and were you still before the time that American evangelical modernized and they were giving sex talks in the youth group, or was that emphasized in your upbringing as far as what we thought of evangelical sex ethic and purity?
Yeah. So I grew up in the 1970s and 80s in Chattanooga, Tennessee, First Baptist Church there. And I tell people, my childhood was sort of just before the rise of the religious right, or that was sort of happening at the edges and I didn't know about it. I didn't really feel it directly. Jerry Falwell was certainly already moving. But by the time 1979 comes, which I think is the year the moral majority was formed, I was 12. So I had sort of been shaped earlier on. And my parents were pillars of our church. My mother was the pastor's secretary for years and years. So we were one of the core families that were there Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night, went to church camp, went to music camp every summer. It has deeply shaped who I am. And in those years, Josh McDowell, whose name you might recall, was an early, he used to travel the country and talk to youth groups, and he wrote books about sexual purity, sort of before. Yes, exactly. Before what we think of now as the purity movement, he was sort of one of those early figures. And I remember him coming to my church. I remember hearing him speak. So it was definitely emphasized. It wasn't preached from the pulpit. And I never heard anyone talk about same-sex anything, homosexuality, either pro or anti. My church was more like, I like to say, the Jimmy and Rosalind Carter sort of Southern Baptist. We weren't so much the Jerry Falwell. We certainly weren't the Paige Patterson, Paul Pressler, which has come to define the Southern Baptist Convention, of course. But still, sex and sexual ethics and morals and no sex before marriage was a very, very strong theme in my church life.
So it sounds like your church, your Southern Baptist church, and I realize listeners or watchers who aren't Southern Baptists may not know the Southern Baptist takeover with Al Mohler and Paige Patterson. And so did your church, I'm just curious for my own interest, did your church go the way of the neo-Calvinists, or did they stay, were they one of the rebel Baptist churches that didn't go with that takeover?
They tried to tread a middle ground. For many years, they stayed dually aligned with the SBC, the Southern Baptist Convention, and the more moderate, liberal, not really very liberal, but more liberal, Cooperative Baptist Fellowship. I think some of that was because some of the money in the church came from elderly people who felt deeply attached to the Southern Baptist Convention and weren't really aware of the political changes taking place there. Eventually, though, the church broke completely away from the SBC and is still a CBF church.
Wow. And I imagine a church, especially a Southern Baptist church in the South in the 70s, certainly before Ronald Reagan, this was most of what you think of conservative religious people in the South were Democrats, no?
Well,
I mean,
it was
they were
mixed.
Before the Reagan Revolution?
They were a mix. In my household, my father was a Republican, my mother was a Democrat, and that was typical. I mean, I don't mean the gender divide, although that probably was typical, but it was really quite a mix, and that was fine. You were in church and in neighborhoods and schools and friends with people of quite different political persuasions. I think that's something that's really dramatically changed since my childhood.
Yeah.
But my parents, they used to argue about politics at home, not bitterly, but vigorously. And the joke always was that they canceled out each other's votes in every election.
Yeah, it reminds me a little of my childhood. My mom was a Bobby Kennedy Democrat, and of course my dad, a young physician, he was a Barry Goldwater, and then of course Richard Nixon, Republican. And then they met, so to speak, politically. Isn't it interesting? They met politically finally at Ronald Reagan. But I think I'm pretty sure my mom voted for Jimmy Carter, and my dad voted for Gerald Ford. One of the thesis and arguments in your book, Moral Combat, is not only did it divide American Christians, it divided American politics for sure. And this is where Marie, your research and your history, your 20th century history is just impeccable. How did that? And I think I remember in the book, the premise is we weren't, up until the 1900s, we weren't divided, at least religiously. Of course, there were left and right politics. Of course, that's been the start of our country, but it didn't seem religion. So what happened that religion invaded politics?
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's, probably more complicated than I can begin to comprehend myself. You can do all the research in the world, and there's just still some mystery to it. But I see the women's suffrage movement as a real turning point, as you know from the book. And I think that something about women having equal rights with men really hit a chord with a lot of folks on the very conservative side. And, we sort of almost think now of women's right to vote as being, an easy win, or that as soon as it was won in 1920, we all went on and accepted that and kept going. And, what I argue in the book is that that's really not the case at all. The country was bitterly divided over that. And the losers of that, the people who had not supported women's right to vote, they didn't go away. They didn't necessarily change their mind. But the politics went in different kinds of directions. But I think that part of our fight over sexuality is a fight over women's rights. And that even today, even battles over reproductive rights and abortion, but even sex education, I think you can see in those controversies a sort of core disagreement over egalitarianism versus, conservative, more complementarianism, or a more hierarchical ideal of gender relationships. So, I think that's where religions that really taught gender hierarchy and female submission to male authority became very important, very prominent, and quite effective in mobilizing people around those ideals, and then around the political parties who began to embody them.
Yeah, so with that, especially your first chapter in the book, which is, I mean, it starts with a tension bang. Especially in the kind of Christianity that now I am part of, which is, of course, overwhelmingly egalitarian. It's kind of like duh. Who even asks that question in the 21st century? But yet, people come from lots of. I mean, I am still asked in our church, will women be treated here the same as a man? And again, I'm always dumbfounded, going, that's probably not questions they're asking so much in the marketplace. It still happens in the marketplace. I don't want to pretend it doesn't. But yes, you just go, oh my gosh, it's still here. So, Marie, how significant was the good trouble that specifically women created in the divide? So I guess we could look at your book and or look at your word, your chosen word, divide, as a negative, and it has a lot of negative, tragic consequences, no doubt. But there's also a bit of good trouble to it, is not? The divide also created, it furthered something more progressive in freeing along, did it not? And how significant were women specifically to that?
Certainly. Well, I mean, speaking personally, I absolutely see that as good trouble. And, the freedoms that I've lived under that were greater than what my grandmother lived under, I don't take for granted at all. So yes, you're absolutely right. Women were very important forces, and women had many allies who were men also, of course. It's not only women who helped make those changes or bring them about. But the resistance to that was growing all the time. The more things changed for progressive change occurred and women gained more rights, the stronger and stronger the resistance became, to that. And so you really do see these two forces, these clashing forces rising together. And, that did create and has created the incredible fractiousness in our politics today. And I don't mean to say that gender is the only source of that. We know that race and racism, there are other sources, debates over immigration, all kinds of things. But I really think that something like, I would call it misogyny, by which I mean not hatred of women, but there's a philosopher who has written about misogyny and said, it's not just the hatred of women, it's really about punishing women who don't accept their place. So it's mocking women for their clothes, it's mocking women for their voices, it's doing things that women do to other women all the time. That's really what I mean. I think that runs quite deep, and that our conservative religious expressions oftentimes are sources of that.
Yes.
I'm interviewing a lot of conservative evangelical women now. I'm writing on the clergy's sexual abuse crisis across American Christianity.
Wow. Yeah.
And
Wow.
I can't tell you, I am meeting evangelical women who, many of whom were homeschooled, who did not know until they came out of that world that women were allowed to vote. They're growing up in these isolated worlds. They don't even know what rights they have. That's been really shattering and deeply disturbing to me to realize that. So I think there's a lot still that we need to unpack about the relationship between religion and gender ideology.
So I'm sure you're familiar with Stephen Prothero's book. I can't quite remember the title, so I'll give a hack job at it, but it was something like why the liberals eventually win even when they lose elections. And then the title is the premise of the book. So here's my question. As you document the 20th century and conservative evangelical Protestants, certainly conservative Catholics as well,
Yes.
Against certain issues that eventually become normalized and accepted in our culture. There's my setup. Here's the question. Marie, why are Christians, or why is American Christianism, I'm choosing that, why has American Christianism been late to the party on so many issues that eventually become normalized in our society, that then even present Christians, even conservative Christians, eventually go, oh yeah, that's normal? I think of mixed racial, what minister today, even a conservative one, would stand in a pulpit today and say that somebody of Chinese descent should not marry somebody of Caucasian descent? What sane, I'm sure there's some crazy minister who would say that, but what sane, even conservative minister would say that today? So there's all these issues that American Christianism was late to the party that then eventually they adopt as if they have no history to it. So why does this late to the party aspect happen?
Well, I agree with your rendering of that. I think that's very perceptive and important to ask that question. I mean, I think as a Southerner myself, and you're living in the South, I know.
Yes.
I think there is something very deeply Southern about conservative evangelicalism. We'll take Catholicism out of it for a moment. But there is something deeply Southern and something deeply about holding on to the heritage of the past and it being very, very difficult to give some of that up. I think there's still in some pockets of the South, including pockets that were very familiar to me growing up and where some of my family still live, almost a bitterness towards the Civil War. We were the righteous cause and we lost and we're going to get it back. So I think that we don't think about that enough, that deep, deep Southern history as being part of why the holding on to the racial hierarchies, the gender hierarchies that the Old South really represented, even for people who didn't have the wealth to have slaves and all that. And why things eventually change. I don't even know how to answer that question. I think it is very, very difficult, but it also has to do with people holding on to their power. People look back to a golden age where they imagine they had status and they had power, and they resent not having those things anymore. And the question is, did they really have that status and power in some imagined past, or is that sort of a myth of some kind? Mm-hmm. So, I write a lot about fear, which is really more, I think, for the psychologists to help us understand. But I just see so much fear in really conservative religion, a sort of fear of that egalitarian model, a fear of giving up one's own power, of being generous to others. And I don't understand. I don't think I can answer the question of where that fear comes from, because like you, it just seems inexplicable to me to be that concerned about everyone having equal rights and being tolerant of people who have different sexual norms than we do. I don't know where that comes from.
Yeah. Well, I'm the minister. You're the academic, but I'm sure you're well aware, just from your personal and academic life, you certainly understand theology. But I'll chant something theological. Marie, I think one of the major shifts that is happening in Christianity that is beyond social issues. It certainly includes social issues, right? It certainly does, which your book covers social quasi things that are theological and social, of course, right, and then end up being political, of course. But I think one of the major shifts that is happening I think classical theism, the concept of the Christianity holding and housing at its center is the classical theistic supernatural God, which then, that's where authority comes from, that's where biblicism comes from, that's where the magical, miraculous Bible comes from. That's where moral, religious absolutes come from, because we have this supernatural God who supernaturally intervened into the human natural world and left us this supernatural religion and ancient book. And I think as people progressively evolve religiously and choose to keep Christian spirituality as part of their, like, there's obviously plenty of people bagging it, just going, I'm done with the whole damn thing, for sure. But I think those who are sticking with it, Christianity has to go beyond this supernatural theistic version of God, which is allowing the fear, because I think your point about the psychological fear is spot on. It seems to me, I'm very curious about where that will end up at the end of the 21st century. Does it, again, I'm just the minister, I'm not the academic. Mm-hmm. Does anything, what I'm saying, does any of that make sense?
No, it absolutely does. It's very interesting to think about it that way. I would say I haven't. And just to say something personal about my own journey that I think is relevant to what you're saying, I was in graduate school before someone said to me that you could love the Bible and be a Christian and not take it literally. I was like 22, 23 years old. And I remember where I was when this person said this to me. It was a UCC pastor, but a friend of mine in graduate school. And my mind was just blown. And I was like, what do you even mean? You can love the Bible? And I had thought that
did you view them as an apostate, or were you beginning to awaken?
No, I had already thought that if I had already questioned my faith and the Bible, and so I just thought I couldn't be a Christian at all. I didn't know there was another way to be a Christian. And so I think that's somewhat similar, maybe to your journey, but it's some dimensions of it. But I just remember realizing, like, oh, I could read the Bible, find the stories profoundly meaningful, see Jesus as a prophet whom I adore and admire and can, think deeply about without having some sense of a supernatural and some sort of certainty about morals in the world. It took me a long time to kind of figure some of that out, but that was, sort of my own journey out of that. So I think taking that back to what you're saying, if you see that in larger societal terms, I guess I don't know. I see a lot more people, as you say, just leaving it all together, looking at Christianity as if the conservative white evangelicals of today represent everything it means to be Christian, and saying, well, I'm not that. I don't want that. Yeah. Or I don't want the Catholic version either, and so there's nothing left,
Mm-hmm. And I think in their, and this is no critique to anybody that leaves. I partly understand why people leave. And they may be saying, and this is my premise and thesis that needs much more thought and distance on, but they may go, I'm leaving because they didn't accept my gay cousin, Lou. I'm leaving because they seem to be dabbling in what is reproductive rights for my body. Sure, I get that. Or they may, or because of all the sexual abuse and hypocrisy, pastoral abuse, or just the rigid doctrine. But I'm saying, oh, no, I get that. But it's even why you're really leaving is because a supernatural God who would control all of those things just doesn't make sense in at least a modern 21st century Western world. Mm-hmm. And this is partly why I say we also need to be careful. Those of us who have evolved from that and stayed, I think we need to watch at times our own reverse fundamentalism and treat our own awakening and evolving as now I've seen the light. Now we've become just like those that that have given us agita. But because there are people in parts of the world that are hanging on their circumstances, they need a supernatural God.
Right.
And we need to hold that. I think we need to hold that with great empathy. But in the West, I think we're seeing, those are my thoughts.
No, that's, if I could respond to that, I think that's very interesting. And I agree that we need to work against a sort of fundamentalism on the secular side, if that's sort of what you're pointing to. Or, what I prefer to think of is mystery. I think we can coexist, people who believe in God, people who aren't sure if God exists, people who are certain God does not exist, but leave it open and let there be mystery and accept other people on their own path and believing different things. And I don't know why that is so difficult for us to do in this society, but we clearly have not done a good job of that. All of our laws about religious freedom to the contrary.
Totally. And, I watched a couple of your lectures. Not only did I read your book, of course, I've watched a couple of your lectures on YouTube. And one of the things your book does, and you point out when you're lecturing, um, you do it so well that when conservative American Christianism latched onto sexuality, 20th century wise, or certainly the inception of America, there have been other worthwhile issues of that would warrant what one would think of religious love and compassion, which would be, poverty, stances on war, certainly civil rights, women's suffrage, now green issues. There are so many things, and obviously sex became, but I'm going to ask a little more of a human and theological question because I am a minister. Marie, where did the conversations of love and compassion? It seems to me that you can't read the New Testament and not come away with, I think the cornerstone of Christianity is love. I think it's love. I think it's inclusion, acceptance, it's remembering the forgotten, it's including the marginalized, it's picking up the fallen. It's all these different ways we speak of love. So with all of these debates in your research, and now I'll even include what you're currently researching, all the, and I'm assuming your book covers Protestant
Yes.
and Catholic abuse?
Yes.
Where does if people Christianize all of these arguments, where does the cornerstone of Christianity of love and compassion and empathy, why has it been lost in that conversation?
Well, I think I would contest the premise slightly there because I
Please.
do not know a Christian, conservative, Catholic, Protestant, right-wing evangelical. I don't know anyone who doesn't say love is core to their faith. I think the difference is what they mean by that, and maybe what liberal Christians, progressive Christians might mean by that. I think there's a much more individual sense on the conservative evangelical side. People care for each other, inside their churches. When someone has a relative die or a child die, people are there. They feed them, they care for them, they hold them, they sit with them, they spend their time and money caring for one another. And I think that extends beyond their own community to a degree. But where that stops and where that doesn't intersect in issues such as, for instance, care for immigrants or refugees in some cases, I think that's kind of the question. Whereas I think what you're describing and what I feel like I believe in as well is a broader love for people in the world, for the suffering everywhere, for the people fleeing war in South America and Central America and coming to our borders, risking their lives, that there is a response of love that I believe in giving those people. And I recognize that many other Christians don't see it in the same way. So I think it's a difference maybe in how people think about, learn about, absorb teachings about what it means to love in the world. Does that ring at all true to you?
Yeah, no, it does. No, and I appreciate your challenge to my point. That's good news for me. So you were raised in this. But you're obvious, you ended up being an intelligent person. You had certainly high academic achievement and then goals. Because you're an academic, we certainly know the historic war between faith and learning more. So what happened to you? And I mean that in the good trouble. What, we live off borrowed convictions for a while. That's the wonder of our parents, and at times, depending on the kind of home we grew up in, the not so wonder of our families. But eventually we can't live off something borrowed. It has to become our own. So what did your, uh, I assume you're no longer what is considered a conservative Christian or an evangelical. So where is your, can I ask you something outside of the academy and where your personal faith is
Sure.
today?
Sure. Well, let me first address your point about being coming out of the world I came out of and being educated. I was very fortunate to be born into a family that believed that we're not only, profound Christian believers, but also believed in education. And
Mm.
I wound up getting an education in high school that was really about question everything, get the evidence, learn how to think critically. Just a really, really strong education for girls in my school. I went to an all-girls school,
Mm.
and that shaped me. And it really helped me. I had felt like when I was in Sunday school and I would have questions, that was sort of frowned on. I remember that feeling of being kind of a bad girl because I asked too many questions or I questioned the answers to the questions about the Bible.
You felt that way or you were
I did.
treated that way? Were you treated
I
that way?
I don't know if I definitely felt that way. If I was treated that way, it might have been a look or it might have just been an attitude. I don't know. In the South, a lot is unspoken.
Mm-hmm.
So I might not have been directly treated that way, but I felt it like, shut up, Marie,
Mm-hmm.
don't ask so many questions.
Mm.
But because I had parents who cared about my education and always supported me and supported me learning, I think that's a huge part of my journey. And I think a lot of Christians don't necessarily have that.
Right.
They have family systems or school systems that really want them to accept the answers they're given and not ask a lot of questions. And that can trap people. Again, interviews I'm having with people now who've come out of that, they look back and think of themselves as trapped earlier in life because they couldn't ask those questions.
Right.
So
That's right.
that's a bit about that. I guess where I've landed now, it's so interesting. I actually
Let
think,
me ask you something before that, though, where
sure,
you've landed now.
okay.
I want us to get to where you've landed now. But did you go to get there? Did you go through some existential faith crisis?
Yes, I I went to college. All the wranglings at the Southern Baptist Convention had really turned me off of church politics. So I was one of those students that went to college and was so relieved not to have to get up on Sunday mornings anymore, and go Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night. I kind of just threw it all out for a bit. But I couldn't do that because it was a part of who I was. I remember I took a class on Nietzsche and, philosophy of religion. And I think really one reason I went on the path I did to become a religion scholar was questioning all these things and wanting to understand and discovering other world religions, discovering that people had studied the history of how religions were shaped, how the Bible came to be put together as one, book. It was mind blowing. There are a lot of scholars of religion who are kind of recovering conservative evangelicals. We are a niche. We're a group of people, and so that helped me. But I think that was my faith struggle and needing to wrestle with what I had been taught in relation to the religions of the world and the knowledge that was out there about religion.
And then, so where are you now?
So, I actually think about this. Am I a Christian? And I think that the answer to that question depends on what the person means if they're asking that question.
Sure.
So if someone is asking me, do I believe all the things you believe to be an evangelical Christian? I say no. No, I definitely am not. Do I try to follow the example of Jesus and think about the Sermon on the Mount and feel deeply connected to the tradition? 100%, and I'm not a churchgoer right now, but I'm not averse to it. I just haven't really found a community. And I guess, you get out of the habit and you don't necessarily, it's like exercise. You stop exercising and you don't go back.
Sure.
So I miss that. I miss that community. So I think am I a Christian in that sense? Absolutely. I do feel myself to be that.
Hmm.
And I think I'm still growing and changing and on that journey too, right? So what I believe today won't be the same as 5 years from now, I'm sure.
Oh, man. And that is, I think, some of the things we say at our church, well, first, I'll hearken back to what you were saying about the Bible and literalism. One of the things we'll say is, hey, we take the Bible so seriously here. This ancient book matters so much to us that there's no way we can take it literally. That's how much it means to us. And I think it's so I make sure I don't plagiarize. I think it's a Marcus Borg. It's either a Walter Brueggemann sort of hack comment or a Marcus Borg comment. But, when we say that at our church, it is like, if I can be overly dramatic, you kind of see people have this Pauline scales falling from their eyes. Like when you were describing you were in grad school, someone said that to you. Hey, you can still take this thing seriously. You don't have to jeopardize that. It can still be meaningful to you. And you can still give up biblicistic literalism. So that's one of the things we'll say. And then the other thing we'll say is Christianity, we think Christianity evolves. We don't think that's what's wrong with Christianity. We think that's everything right with Christianity. Christian spirituality is like any living thing. And I'll just say the same thing to echo what you said. I hope I think and believe different things 5 years from now, 10 years from now. And maybe some of the things I believe right now, I won't believe 5, 10 years from now. And that's not what's wrong with my faith. That's everything right. With it.
I feel like I've learned a lot from the Jewish tradition, from thinking about that. The Jewish tradition is a tradition of argument. It's a tradition of great Jewish minds disagreeing with each other and arguing with each other and coming out at the end of the day not saying, well, you're not a Jew. We're all Jews, but we see things differently. And, I've so many of my Jewish students, actually, I've seen this even in the classroom, are able to argue and are much more adept at arguing than some of the students who grew up in backgrounds like I grew up in. Like, we have to learn how to argue because it's not considered polite. Or we were taught there was sort of one right answer to every question, and it was probably Jesus, And so thinking about that we can all debate and take those texts seriously and read the commentaries upon the text that go back generations. I mean, Christians, we just don't have that in the same way. We have, in the Catholic tradition, there's a body of text that's sort of creating doctrine, and here's the doctrine. It's not arguments necessarily, anything outside of this is heresy. So I think there's, to me, the sort of Jewish tradition gets something deeply right intellectually and spiritually in allowing for that argumentation and in that history.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And I think I've said this every single podcast that I've done because it somehow comes up organically. Marie, here in town, one of my best friends is a Jewish rabbi. Mm-hmm. Now, if you caught me in the 1990s when I was a young Campus Crusade staff member, I would have taken him to lunch and tried to figure out how I can share Old Testament verses with him to try to convert him to Jesus. I don't have to do that anymore. But what you have learned from your Jewish friends, same thing. I see that he's taught me so much about that the point of argument and debate has been so rich in the Jewish tradition and not certainly not since Calvinism, for sure. But of course, Catholic doctrine has its own story with church authority. But yes, it seems so rich. And in my progressive friends, progressive religious friends, that seems to be taking on. And I'll just send this out as a wonder. I don't have a lot of energy or thought on it yet. I wonder if Jews have a different perspective, as you know, towards salvation There is no, there's no man in a white hat and a man in a black hat with the human damsel tied to the railroad tracks, and both of them are arguing over who possesses this. That's not in so much the Jewish narrative. And so you wonder that once Christian soteriology, Christian salvation became part of the narrative, that now, authority, absolutes, because we have to save people or they go to damnation. I don't know, but I wonder if that partly eliminates the debate argument.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. I think it's always been part of the urgency of the Christian tradition is to try to save the world. I mean, certainly as a Southern Baptist girl growing up with the Great Commission, you were supposed to bring the gospel to all nations, and missionaries are sort of raised to the height. They're doing the work in the world. I sometimes miss my strong belief in heaven that I had when I was young. My father died a couple years ago. I was very close to him. And my mother is still much more traditional in her belief system. And she has a strong belief in heaven. She has a certainty that she'll see him again, that he is now with his loved ones. And it was easier for her to accept his death because of that than it was for me. Because I have that hope, but I don't have that strong belief that those things are true. So, that's hard. Yeah, I think it's very hard to give those things up. There is a loss that maybe some of us never fully get over. You feel that loss in yourself of some of those beliefs.
No, I think that's a very, you give a very human, heartfelt answer. No, I'm glad I'm glad I'm no longer evangelical and hold to some of those rigid fundamentalist beliefs that I know also hurt me psychologically, hurt me relationally, even damaged love, truly damaged my love effort towards others. So I'm glad I don't have that. But to what you do speak of, oh no, it was not, yay, I'm losing this. No, there was deep grief. And I remember I was, about 12 years ago, I was the minister of this large megachurch, and we were doing our Christmas Eve services. And we were going to, through the day, 5,000 people would attend throughout the day. And I was in the crisis of wondering where I stood. And the church had a lot of property, and it had a little picnic shelter. And it was an unusually warm Christmas Eve in Nashville. It was 70, it was sunny. And I think our first service, we did multiple services through the day on Christmas Eve. And the first one started at 1 o'clock. And at 12 noon, I was out behind the church in the picnic shelter, weeping like I was a young boy, going, I don't know if I even believe in this stuff anymore. And so I come into the church. There was the office I had at the time had a bathroom, and I splashed water in my face, and I did the 4 different church services through the day, and I walked off the stage at the last Christmas Eve service ready to go home, and one of my staff members goes, David, I think that was the best Christmas Eve services you've ever done. And I drove home hollow and empty of just going, oh my gosh, I know how to do it. I know how to do it. But, wow. And yes, I had to go on a long, long journey. And part of that journey is, and our church is filled with people with your story and my story, and it's also a story of grief. But if I could be so silly and kind of a ziggy this and Christianize this, one of the great things I still appreciate about the Christian narrative is through death comes life. And so it's something I still value in my Christian spirituality, that when things do die, there is grief. But as things die, I still hold to the hope that this is how we get life.
Amen.
So, Marie, what you do such a great job. Your book documents the moral combats of the 20th century incredibly, and from the prologue takes us right up to the 2015 decision of gay marriage. What are the moral combats today? What are the post your book? What are the if this is divided American Christians, we're assuming it's dividing American politics, and all you have to do is watch the 3 cable networks, and it certainly does. What are the moral combats you're seeing today?
Right. Well, we're sitting here talking just a week or so after the Alabama judge, made the decision about IVF and embryos being full persons, equivalent to you and me, and the broader implications of what that's going to mean. That certainly seems like a front in the wars over life and abortion and reproductive access. My book was published at the very end of 2017. So we've had Roe v. Wade turned over since then. A lot has happened. I see those as really major political turning points, and I think they are weaponized to get people to the polls and vote. And also because I am writing about clergy sexual abuse, as you say, I am writing about that across not just Catholic, but evangelical, liberal, Protestant. I mean, there's not a denomination that's been spared a scandal, and often a cover-up, which is the greater scandal than the abuse itself. And people's responses to that are really quite shocking. The divide in our country over people who care about what Trump had to say about grabbing women's genitals, or the court case with Jean Carroll, the people who care deeply about those issues and what they say about his character, and the people who frankly do not or don't care enough to think that disqualifies him from being president. That is a culture war. That is a major moral divide, and a point of combat in our politics. So I knew when I finished the book, I couldn't keep writing it forever because more things were going to keep happening all the time. But I think these ongoing debates about women are still very real. I don't think any of the issues I wrote about in that book are settled forever. There are moments when our politics shift one way or the other, but these issues seem to keep coming back up over and over again.
Yeah, and to the point of your book and your own insight in it, right? It's still about sex. Now that Roe v. Wade was overturned, the IVF thing you saw that you pointed out last week in Alabama, the state-by-state women's reproductive rights, right? It's still about sex. I guess the gay issue is now turned to the trans issue, right?
Right.
The gender issue. So it's still about sex, isn't it?
Mm-hmm. It is, and and anxiety about sex is also about the anxiety of wanting to control people's lives and making them behave in a certain way. And I just think we are going to continue to see that over and over again. We're not the tolerant country we want to think we are a lot of times, especially when it comes even to private behavior. It's so interesting because people care so much about liberty and rights, but the people who care so deeply about, say, gun rights are often the people who, don't see the same when they look at sexual rights, the right to one's own private consensual sexual behavior. So it's such a fascinating conundrum, how these terms get used in different ways, and how people's politics fall out around these issues of sex and liberty and rights.
Yeah, I was talking to scholar and ethicist David Gushee a couple weeks ago, and he was citing that when the Iraq War broke out, conservative Christians who, back to your point in moral combat, the evangelical, even Catholic conservatives who would land on the side of sexual conservative were predominantly and very supportive of torture during the war. That Christian conservatives were overwhelmingly supportive of torturing the enemy.
Right.
It's just, it's mind-boggling.
Well, even something like the death penalty, capital punishment, and I don't mean to get us into another, that's a very complicated issue, and I don't want to oversimplify it, but the real core lack of support for death penalty reform, even in Catholic circles, and Catholic doctrine technically is opposed to the death penalty, but, the folks who are so concerned about life, and yet, who really don't see, something like that as a life issue. Anyway, it's none of us are consistent. Let's just say that none of us are consistent in the ways that we wish that we were. But it's easier to see the inconsistencies in other people's positions than our own. But having said that, I do see this as a real inconsistency that's out there.
No, and thanks for bringing it back. Right? I mean, it keeps us. That's right. We're all human in this, and we're all flawed. And I don't even think you have to have a theological view of that. We're all in progress. So this book, when's this new book come out? When will we see this book?
Well, thank you for asking. I'm still at the interview stage. I've interviewed about 100 survivors and family members, pastors, church staff, lawyers, people involved in the abuse crisis in one way or the other. And I just can't rush that process because the stories are so powerful and very painful. And, I have to digest a lot of that. So the book is a couple years away, at least, probably. What is this, 2024? I would say 2026 or 2027, probably, before I can really get it done. Scholarship is slow.
Yeah, sure. And can I ask, I certainly don't reveal what you can't reveal. So my question is maybe in what you're learning. And I've often wondered this, keeping on to the sexual divide even now within the church, not when I was an evangelical, I had a number of experiences as a young minister of showing up at my church office. This is when I was an associate or line minister, before I had, reached being the lead or senior pastor, the lead minister, where we had to meet, the whole staff had to meet because a staff member had been sexually naughty and had to then confess that to the staff and then be removed. So I asked this question, worrying about that I needed to even think more about my question, because abuse, I want to make sure I say, abuse is abuse, period. Power in abuse is abuse of power. There's no doubt about it. Molestation is So I just want to be clear. But as you've talked with these hundreds of people, and of course, I'm assuming they're victims, but when you said you talked to clergy, you've even talked to perpetrators.
No.
Is that right as well?
No, not yet. I would like to, but no, the clergy that
Right.
I've talked to are people working for reform within the institutions.
Okay. Which is okay. So, as you've talked with these hundreds of people and you're in the middle of your research, back to the sex question, sex theological question. And I ask this with no bait. I just wonder if American conservative Christianism, not so infiltrated with authoritative supernatural biblicism, and now applying that to a sexual purity ethic, if that didn't exist, would that have changed, or could that have changed abuse?
Well, I certainly, yes.
And
I mean, I certainly
okay.
think that's a piece of it. But I also think that it's about clergy being trained that they are above the law. And that's true. I see that in the Catholic priesthood. And I see that in the evangelical ministry. But I have also interviewed survivors in the Episcopal Church, in the United Methodist Church, in the Presbyterian Church USA. And I don't think it's as endemic there. And I don't think the cover-ups are nearly as endemic. But I think it is about the biblicism and the kind of sex obsession, but it is also about a sort of personal sense of power. I start worrying about who is drawn to certain models of ministry and who is drawn to certain models of what church is. So there's a lot. I mean, I'm in the midst of it and I don't want to make proclamations, but I think what you're saying is absolutely true. But I think there are a lot of factors to think about.
It's layered.
Yes.
Yeah, I think you're right. And my question is far more simple than a very layered answer, nuances that it needs. I do wonder, and thus, if I can make as the minister, if I can make this theological, back to your point of the minister, whether it's the minister priest or the minister pastor with power, therein lies, for me, as I progressed in that, therein lies the theological issue of classical supernatural theism. Because when you have an authoritative God, now you have authoritative clergy. When you have an authoritative absolute word, that then the authoritative absolute clergy gets to handle, protect, preach, propagate, proclaim. It's all tentacled. It's all capillaried. It's just baked into the potion, and that is what, as Christianity not goes into the 21st century, as Christianity goes into its third millennium. I think this is why it's bigger than the social issues. The social issues matter because they reveal the wound. But I think it's a bigger, deeper theological, and this is the shift that I think, and that I'm trying to rethink and reform and reimagine in Christianity.
That's so powerful. I that's really helpful for me to think about it that way. And this ministerial that God, and also the certainty that one understands that God, or the certainty that one understands, God's will. I feel like I hear that over and over again too. So it's not just the issue of the all-powerful God. It's the sense there's an all-powerful God, and I'm going to tell you, people in the pews, what the meaning of all of this is and what the truth is. And that just feels like a danger to me. So I really appreciate your perspective on that.
Well, Marie, Dr. Griffith, thank you so much for this time, and we look forward to this book. And I'm encouraged to hear that. Obviously, we hear about all of this in the news. I'm glad that a capable, a wonderful, a gifted academic is doing deep work on this issue, and will, yes, take all the time you need to produce a fruitful book. But thank you so much for this time. I really appreciate you being on this podcast.
Well, I've really enjoyed talking to you, David. I'm so glad you invited me. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Great. Hope to see you down the road.
Absolutely. Take care.